We had Afghan National Development Strategy. We had 23 priorities of Afghan government, Tokyo Mutual Understanding, and many, many other documents. But unfortunately, what I have seen as an Afghan on and on, we always have conferences after conferences, communiques after communiques, strategies after strategies, but no one is there to check and balance how much Afghan government have achieved, how much international community itself have kept its commitment of funding, and also accountability towards the funding that was given to Afghanistan. And for many Afghans like myself, it has been seen that international community was more than happily providing blank checks to Karzai regime, and unfortunately now with the national unity government without even seeing how it has impacted the life of Afghans.
Last bit.
Yeah,
with comments,
and a question to
question fast.
Sure. I totally agree with you about the alliances of international community and Karzai with the warlords. And unfortunately, what we have been sold in the past 15 years, that they are the people who can keep the country stable. And we know this is not the case. So how do you see that in terms of Kandahar when Gul Agha Shirzoi was removed and nothing really happened? And how did you use that as an opportunity to prove that warlords are not a source of stability in the country?
I'm fanning the chair all over the place, so you got away with that. But questions, not long comments. Try and keep yourself to sort of 30 seconds or so. Gentleman here.
My name is Javed Nadir. I'm the director of British and Irish Agencies Afghanistan Group. Thank you for the presentations. One question from Ashley. Rangina's father's quote was quite strong. Lions made from mice. So it means that many of these people were not lions before. And also, the current network has enabled them to be lions. But we also see some examples in Herat, for example, where a governor who was not from Herat, who was not even Sunni, who the majority of Heratis are, ruled Herat for 4 years or so, Sayyid Hussain Anwari. So are there chances that these networks could be changed for good or for bad? And one question from Sam. You said in the past 15 years, the farmers or the populations in these three provinces are worse off. Is it in comparison to 15 years ago, or recently they have been worse off? Thank you.
Okay, and I'll feed in the questions from the online gradually. The first one was to Rangina from Richard, asking, to what extent does business development include cultural development or cultural change? So over to you. Maybe let's start with Rangina on the left, and then chip in as you feel you need to, Ashley and Adam.
To Huria Jan's question about warlords not being a source of instability, I totally agree with you. After Gul Agha Shirzai, this fear of many years, if we remove him, we're going to lose Kandahar. That was not the case. Of course, the move was gradual because they did bring his supporter after him, and then slowly moved on and brought someone who's totally not affiliated with Gul Agha Shirzai to today, where our governor is actually an educated man from Herat. And I think as a citizen, he's quite successful in Kandahar, and he's liked by the majority of the population. Now, politically, there are other issues that obviously we have to deal with, but you don't need to have a warlord in place to keep that place safe and secure. So it's a false attitude of the international community to, I think, just keep these warlords in power when the Afghan citizens certainly don't agree with and don't allow. In terms of business development, also with cultural development, I think that's a great question. And one of the reasons of the success of Kandahar Treasure in a place like Kandahar is that we've kept the idea of the culture in mind while we designed how we would work. So we don't have a factory where all of our workers come on a daily basis to work, although we do have a production site that has the full-time staff. So the majority of our workers are still home-based. all of the women are working in their home at the pace of their life, raising their children, cooking and cleaning, and taking care of their families. And so the income that they earn while being at home has slowly allowed their men, which are basically the power brokers at the community level, to accept that it's okay for women to earn. And one cultural benefit to us in Kandahar, which is a predominantly Pashtun region, is that the men won't accept the money from the women or won't take the money from the women because it's beneath their manhood. So it's actually to our advantage as women in working in a region like Kandahar. I do know that if we had not kept this cultural sensitivity in mind, we would probably be faced with either attacks or just verbal accusations of doing something that we were not supposed to. So I think Kandahar Treasure is a great model to prove that if you work even in a place like Kandahar, where Taliban are still pretty much in power. I mean, they might not be officially, but they are very mentally and socially, knock on wood, but we have not to this day received a threat or any concern that we should be worried for either stopping our operation or restructuring our operation. And I've even joked about this, and maybe not so lightly, that God forbid, but even if the Taliban were to come back to power completely, I think Kandahar Treasure can still go forward and provide working opportunity to all the women beneficiaries that work with us.
Adam, first question on the timeline of the panel study.
The straight answer is it depends where you are. And if you look at households in Sarapur, who in 2002 had moved out a long time ago because of the drought and came back and re-establishing themselves in 2002, 2003. And then there were the boom years of the opium economy, in which they did extremely well. Mazar was also building up, so there was urban opportunities in the brick kiln. Then there was the drought of 2008, and the economy simply collapsed. And also things were tough in Balkh. In the recent years, they've recovered themselves because of opium. Now, the trajectory in Herat is very different, in that, by and large, partly because of generational change, over 15 years, people die, land gets divided, so you've got a shrinking of farm sizes, water scarcity. You've seen a general long-term decline in the prosperity of the agrarian economy, the increasing importance of remittances. In Kandahar, it's different. The boom of the urban economy allowed people to survive in rural areas. So there was a boom period linked to an urban economy which has now collapsed, and the agrarian economy, because of land ownership structures and drought, offers less. So it depends where you are.
And Ashley, over to you.
Yeah, just picking up on what Rangina said about the lions from mice and Javed's question. I mean, absolutely. People like Shirzai and Atta and certainly smaller fish lower down. There are many people who've risen up to be these incredible, menacing lions, although I might use choice other words in other settings to describe them, who were nothing before. And it's very much through the international community's often unwitting investment in them. But if you're relying on people like Razak, you already lost the war. I mean, you sealed your fate by pursuing that strategy. It was never going to be something that brought stability. Quite the contrary. It's brought greater resentment, frustration, anger, chaos, uncertainty, and instability. When it comes to change, I mean, the example of Herat, I think, is an interesting one, simply because I think what you often find is the appointment to official positions does not actually always reflect who's actually in control. And what looks like reform, a new progressive governor, they have no chance of succeeding because they can't actually tap into the networks. If you're not Shia, if you're not someone who has, your local base of support, there's no way. I think you can do good, but it isn't by playing by the rules. And there certainly are people who've been outspoken, reform-minded, and savvy, politically savvy. People like Rangina's father and people I've worked with when I worked for the UN in the east of Afghanistan. Most of those people are, unfortunately, as Rangina sort of the note she ended on, are dead. I mean, that's the cost. Whether or not there can be change, I think right now is very interesting because things are changing. Things are becoming more unstable, and that instability is creating maybe openings. And I won't say if they're positive or negative. I think it's not useful to apply those labels. But things are rapidly shifting. And I think there are opportunities to influence and shape things, particularly at the local level. I mean, if you look at the macro level, if you look at the central government, I mean, it's a dismal prospect. But I think Afghanistan is a very big country with very important microdynamics that need to be considered. And there's opportunities seized. Yeah, just to answer Horia's important question, I'm glad you asked about the conferences, because I think they're a waste of money. They're incredibly pointless. They're increasingly disgraceful and disheartening. They're a piece of performance art. I don't expect anything to come from Brussels. I didn't expect anything to come from London. I didn't expect, when I worked for Oxfam many years ago, to come from the conferences I wrote press releases for. But they are an opportunity for discussions like these. They're an opportunity for me to say that, to be critical, for you to say that, to be critical, at a time when the world is rapidly forgetting about Afghanistan. And so they are important pegs, but only if they're used sort of effectively and subversively.
Okay, we've got a growing list of online questions. Rest assured I will get to you, people who are asking questions online. I'll take 2 and 2 now, so here and here, and I will come around this side soon, but over to you first.
Thank you, Barbara Stapleton, former political advisor to the EU in Afghanistan for too many years. My first question is to Adam, which is that given in the case of Afghanistan and indeed many other parts of the world, it's not a question of lessons learned but lessons spurned, are there any moves to move away from these outdated development models that you conclude Afghanistan has been subject to? And even though these international conferences are political theatre, it's been very important in past political conferences and donor conferences on Afghanistan to have a strong civil society input. And Rangina, I wonder what key points civil society is going to be making in the lead up to next month's conference.
Thank you. Darren.
Darren Evans from Oxfam. I just wanted to ask quite a similar question to that about the development model. If that development model isn't working, what is? And if we look, you're saying the agricultural development model isn't working, but actually opium is working, and last I remember it was sort of a crop. And the other question is, are we trying to do too much? I mean, Paul started with the question of, can we just help improve people's lives in an equilibrium, or can aid actually change that equilibrium? By trying to change that equilibrium, are we actually trying to do too much?
Thank you. We've got 2 sort of interlinked questions around CDCs. Laurie from Care Netherlands wanted to ask Ashley, how can community development councils play a positive role in a context where access networks shape the interests of rural communities in Afghanistan? And Karim wanted to ask Adam and Ashley, what role will CDCs play now that IDLG is playing a greater role in subnational governance? So Adam and Ashley, interlinked ones for you. Adam, why don't we start with you this time?
Okay. Well, you look at the World Bank's agricultural sector review of 2014 was simply a reiteration, which for Afghanistan was simply a reiteration of its World Development Report 2008, the agrarian transition model, an even more skimpy and ahistorical assumption of aspiration rather than any realization. I think there is actually elsewhere in fact, interesting, at the DSA in Oxford, the Development Studies Association conference, the lead speaker this week was Tanya Murray-Lee. And she's begun to write about the notion of surplus populations. And it's not just Afghanistan, but in the sense that there are parts of East Asia, South Asia, where in a sense there are massive rural populations where the opportunities for work, employment, or even subsistence in the agrarian sector are rapidly disappearing. That they will not find opportunities within the productive work, in the productive world. Now, this also chimes with the work South Africa, and the name escapes me at the moment. Give a man a fish. Can anyone?
No.
Thank you, James Ferguson, looking at how rural households in South Africa, of course with a long history of dispossession, of access to land and so forth, beginning to survive, and paying much greater attention to the distributional economy, which I talked about in terms of the Afghan economy as well. But the assumptions, and I think there's a wider argument in the Western world as well, that is there going to be work and employment for everyone in the productive world? And I think it's not just in the West that we're seeing these questions. I think it's becoming, to my view, the evidence is emerging more strongly that even within agrarian economies, there are not going to be the opportunities for productive work, even for subsistence, for those populations who are still in rural sectors. In that sense, the notion of surplus. So to me, that raises major questions, which I think have not been addressed or not considered. There's just been this evolutionary model of development that has stuck. And I'm glad to see that the chief, some years ago, the chief advisor to DFID, the economic advisor, actually raised this comment. Is it right that we should always assume that agriculture will be the route for development? It's a model that's stuck, but does it really apply? The conditions have changed, the circumstances are not there anymore. So, I think we do have to move away from outdated models, and I think the development model is problematic, and I think we need to rethink, under circumstances, given the evidence we've got, the opportunities for employment in the rural sector are simply not there. The number crunching exercise that the World Bank went through, quite frankly, which it didn't reveal its figures, are based on gross simplifications, assumptions of wage rates, and don't make any comments about what sort of work, what quality of work, what the decency of that work will actually be. It was just a number exercise. The opium is an interesting question because it's the exception that proves the rule, and I have argued elsewhere, it is the perfect rural development crop. But then why is that the case? It responds to a strong demand, not in Afghanistan, but elsewhere. Its market structures are extremely interesting. They're rather like an outgrower scheme, where in a sense the risk is taken out of the market because people have guaranteed prices. There's farm gate purchase, there's guaranteed access to credit, and it is high value. And you see that to some extent in tobacco as well. The narcotic crops are good rural crops, but of course are not acceptable, and there's a borderline across, you shift from opium to tobacco. But I don't see any other crop that is going to offer those sorts of those sorts of properties and structural relations in comparison with opium.
Okay, we'll have to encourage both questioners and the panel to be quicker because I've got 4 more online questions to get through and audience here who want to get stuff in. Ranjina, civil society input into Brussels, and then
sure.
Might take some more
thank you for the question. I would actually say 3 things that I've heard from my colleagues of civil society members in Kandahar that they wanted to convey as a message to Brussels is that one is that we want the international community to recognize the gains and the achievements of the past 15 years, in particular to women's development in Afghanistan, and we want the world to not forget or not jeopardize that as we move forward. Number 2, in terms of security, or lack of security on the ground, this has been shared loud and clear from the day that I can remember being an Afghan citizen, is that the interference of our not-so-nice neighboring countries is a problem for Afghanistan, and until and unless the international community takes a much more active role in trying to either prevent and or forcing them to stop what they're doing with us, we Afghans realize that we simply don't have the resources. We have the will, but we realize that we cannot go to war again with another country at this time. So a huge pressure on our neighboring countries. And then finally, the Afghan economy needs to build itself. So something to the effect of agriculture, why people depend on opium as production is because we have a great source of being able to grow crops, but we have no market because our neighbors have taken or overtaken our markets within the country. So cheap products, edibles coming from Pakistan or Iran simply make it not competitive for Afghans to compete with those prices with the infrastructure issues that we have on the ground. And so until and unless we have that ability, either stopping that import and or putting higher taxes on that so that the Afghan produce can have a marketability inside Afghanistan, we really won't be able to build Afghan's economy.
I'm going to start with 2 online questions and then go to the floor. Karim would like to ask Rangina, who are the alternative leaders and how can they be further legitimized from within and from outside? Justin from the Red Cross would like to ask the panel, the World Humanitarian Summit put focus on the need for channeling support towards national actors. Does the panel see this as happening? And actually, I'll fit in one more video from ODI. I would like to ask Rangina or Adam, are there types of livelihood interventions that you believe would be more effective in reducing extreme or chronic poverty in Afghanistan? And I'll now take a couple. That will give us 5, which might be too much. So feel free to be slightly selective in your answers and sort of pick the ones you really want to focus on. I had one over here, I think, a gentleman at the back.
Abdul Rahman Saber, one of the Afghan graduates. I would like to ask a question regarding parallel structures and how much they have affected the efforts of state building, particularly if Jackson can kind of elaborate on this. And what's the way forward as we talk of the continuation of the national unity government? Thank you.
And I had some urgent hands there. Gentleman at the front. Yes, you introduce yourself.
Just wanted to
introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry, Rod Dubitsky. I'm with BRAC UK. I wanted to see what the panel thought of the in Peru. There was a great transition from coca to cash crops, cocoa and coffee. I wanted to see what the panel thought about the applicability of that model in the Afghanistan context. I understand it's greatly different, but it was somewhat successful in at least Peru and other countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Ashley, why don't we start with your answer to the first question?
Yeah, so I guess I'll take that and maybe one of the online ones. So to Abdullah's question about parallel structures, I think part of my understanding is that these aren't parallel structures. It's, these are, they're sort of the vines that are choking the nascent state. I mean, they are, when you look at the Kandahar security forces or the security forces in Balkh or in Uruzgan, it was militias who were absorbed and those remain. If you look at district level in various districts, it was the cadres and the sort of networks of various power holders that were absorbed into the CDC, the district councils in whatever form they exist in these kinds of things. So it's not as though they're these separate parallel structures. They're the formation of the state. And to me, that's a big problem, is that state formation relied on individual personality-centric networks, which creates a lot of instability. It creates a closed system of access, where, again, these relationships are required. What does that mean for the national unity government and the prospects? I think anything can happen. It's slightly exciting and terrifying, but I think what the national unity government is showing is a transition that was not intended. We talk about the transformation decade, but now you have a coming apart at the seams of a political settlement that held for over 10 years. And the tectonic plates beneath the sort of edifice of the Afghan government, both formal and informal, shifting. So at the central level, you see a lot of instability, which is very worrying to the UN, the international community, and so on and so forth. At local level, it's much more interesting to look at different places. We were talking about Kandahar this morning. Kandahar has been remarkably stable for a couple of years. It was sort of my last trip to Afghanistan. I ended up going up north and found, the sort of security map had flipped. I would have preferred much more to go to Kandahar because at least it's predictable. There's some sort of consolidated political settlement there. So perhaps there's more certainty, there's more ability to maneuver. It's not saying things are easy, whereas in a place like Kunduz and Takhar in the northeast, it's much, much less stable. So I think... Yeah, I'm sort of rambling, but let me just, I wanted to sort of, I have no really good answer to that question, although it's interesting is what I was going to say. But there was a question about Justin from the Red Cross about local organizations, and I think what I would say is donors in Afghanistan have talked a lot about trying to fund Afghan organizations. DFID in particular started a civil society fund. There have been other efforts, but they have been insufficient. And I think, as in other countries like Somalia, Yemen, and so on, you see these layers and layers and layers of subcontracting, which add to waste and fraud. And I think that continues to be a problem that we don't see a lot of movement on.
Thank you. I'm going to squeeze in the last online question because it's kind of similar to the other one, so I think you can answer it both, Adam. Hans from CDI would like to ask what, in your view, would be the 3 most important points of change in agriculture of rural society to start to move towards a better situation. So that kind of links with the question around the types of livelihood interventions. So I'll hand that to you, Adam, and then Rangina will come to you on alternative leaders.
I'm not sure I can come up with 3 in sort of ranked order, but jobs would be my first answer, employment. And I mean, it's very striking that much of the infrastructural work that has been put into Afghanistan did not prioritise employment creation. I mean, a lot of the major roads and so forth were put in capital intensive, and a lot more could have been done in terms of job creation. I would say job creation is the most important thing. It creates cash. How that cash gets used is then stimulates all sorts of other activities. That's what the opium economy actually did. It brought cash into the economy that had all sorts of effects. That is what is needed, and I would say that is the priority.
Great.
Coming to the question of alternative leaders, I think Afghanistan has around 35 million people, give or take. And I will not accept that our leadership is only the handful of corrupt leadership that exists right now. 35 million people is a lot of alternative. Now, of course, it's harder, it's more expensive to think outside of the box and to invest in new energies and new leadership, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist or that it's not possible. I also want to say that let's not only look at men as our only alternative. One excuse that we are wonderfully given, both by Afghans and the international communities, that, women simply are not qualified. Well, gather all the men leaders in Afghanistan, even today, and ask how much of that leadership is actually literate. So if we are able to invest in illiterate men to become leaders who have a track record of destruction and killing and blood on their hand, literally, and allow them the opportunity to lead a country, why can't we use that same notion and invest in women who might be illiterate? But the one pride that I take as a woman is that luckily we don't have too many women with blood on their hand. We have not too actively been involved in destroying our nation. And I say that the worst we can do is not do worse than the men that have done in our country. So let's give women a chance to build our future.
Okay, we're going to take one more round of people who've got to be super disciplined on speed, and we'll take 2 or 3. Gentleman here, gentleman at the back, lady here.
My name is
Sorry, over there. I didn't know.
My name is Nur Kashani. I'm working with Khan Foundation here in the UK. My question is to Mr. Adam. To what extent do you think the recent regional initiatives will resolve?
Missed the question.
The recent regional initiatives in Afghanistan, the electricity supply line from the north to the south, or the railway initiative that we had the first train that arrived from China. All these, to what extent do you think they will help the rural economy, because the national unity government is quite proud of these initiatives, and you hear about them all the time in the media. Thank you.
Gentleman at the back. Mic on the way.
Thanks. Ben Lovelock, independent consultant. I'm very briefly interested in the panel's views on what can be done in terms of development approaches to supporting the rule of law, which has clearly come up as an issue.
And just in front.
Hi, my name is Mariela. I work for Women International. And my question is, bringing it back to the household level and bringing it back to the women. So you described the system of, it's like very much like personality based, and also about the elite being the ones that can kind of open or grant access to services and basic services. And I was wondering, in a situation where women so many times are not allowed maybe to even leave the house. Like, how do the women negotiate and access for themselves and maybe their children these basic services such as like, yeah, health, education, etc.?
Okay. Ashley, do you want to start with the rule of law question?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, that's sort of the hardest one. But, I mean, the simple and perhaps flippant answer is, you know, stop letting the primary violators run the country. I mean, I think this is what rule of law has always struggled with, is the big picture, macro level contradiction. Rangina can talk more and more about some of the aspects of this. We were talking about this morning. But certainly there's been very little progress. It hasn't been helped by competing donor ideas of what rule of law is, what it should look like, competing donor debates about, you know, what the informal justice sector means. Should it be formalized? Should it be, you know, all these kinds of things. But that's not unique to rule of law. That's across every single sector you look at. So yet another question I don't really have a cogent answer to, but it is a very good question. But I would just say to the last question very briefly, that women are players in this system. There are certainly powerful women in Afghanistan who have their own sorts of networks, and I can think of a couple of parliamentarians and so on and so forth who play very active roles in this respect. But women are disempowered. I mean, these networks are closed and they track along gradients of very patriarchal kinds of, you know, tribe, ethnicity, you know, the sort of mujahideen kind of alliances that, of course, women were by and large excluded from. So these kinds of things. And so it's harder. And I think when it comes to, you know, mediated access, they often have to go through husbands and brothers and fathers to gain access to these networks. So they have an extra layer often to navigate in these things.
Rangina, I was going to give you that one as well.
Yeah, no, I actually want to address the rule of law, and that the rule of law really has to start by the examples of cases, meaning if the legal system in Afghanistan find a case that needs legal, or I can't speak English anymore, but that requires a level of justice, and with all the evidence that is available, if that case is not brought as an example of justice to the public at large, then obviously the system has failed. And we have continuously, and I want to also point this out, that it's not only the Afghans that are part of the problem. The international community is equally responsible for perpetuating an unjust legal system in Afghanistan by paying bribes, by continuing the illegal structure of how things are done in Afghanistan. So while I criticize my own citizens to be corrupt, we're not the only ones. And then depoliticizing the justice system as well. Let's not bring politics into the justice. So if I'm a warlord and my son commits a crime, my son should face the same legal sentence as a poor farmer's son. Equally, and so my political force should not be taken into consideration. And I promise you that if one or two or three prime examples are shown to the Afghan population that that justice was served, the insecurity and corruption in Afghanistan will probably drop to 40 or 50% overnight. And maybe I'm exaggerating, but Afghan citizens will follow law if they know that there's force behind it. And when it comes to women's, with all the problems that are existing in Afghanistan, one approach, and an approach that I have over close to 15 years of experience in, is that in the majority of Afghanistan, maybe not every part of Afghanistan, but I've found that women only, or a concept of separate but equal, works. And so as long as you empower women within a women-only structure, then the men have no room to criticize, Because the one major criticism that we face as Afghan citizens is that democracy is immoralizing us, is demoralizing us, is making us women with mini skirts and tank tops and throwing our scarves up and smoking and drinking. This is how democracy is defined on the ground at the very local village level. And so in order to address this misconception, I believe that if we empower women separately, there will come a time eventually, if the world is patient enough, where women and men will be able to then work together. But until we are able to empower women at that level, we can symbolically fill a 27% parliament, but it merely remains a symbolic parliament in the end.
Adam, trains and electricity.
Yeah, well, no, actually, just a little comment, and then trains and electricity. Well, I think the model of separate spheres is absolutely right. But, households are arenas of cooperation and conflict and resistance. A little story from Kandahar, households around the issue of mobile phones and women having mobile phones is extremely interesting. One of our household transcripts narrates an event whereby the nephew said to his uncle, I think, well, why doesn't your wife have a mobile phone? And he simply said, under no conditions will any woman in this house have a mobile phone. The fact the nephew asked that question also tells you something about emerging views and challenges to hierarchical structures. And then we come across other households, an independent woman who said, yes, I have a mobile phone, but I don't tell anyone, and I use it. So, access is shifting. There are changes afoot. On the infrastructure question, a necessary condition but not sufficient. I can point to wonderful new roads that run into Sarapul. You get to the end and it's a donkey economy. People cannot afford to pay the fares to travel in taxis. They still go by donkey along the road to the market to buy what they can. So yes, they are acquired, but they have long-term, they're in a sense to be useful, they have long-term, you need to look long-term. It's not enough on their own.
Okay. We're coming to an end. I'm hungry. We can continue the debate sort of over and after lunch. The panel will continue to be here. I'm going to say a couple of things to wrap up. Then if you guys have sort of burning things you want to add, do, and then we'll close. First thing, obviously, is do read the SLRC research that Ashley and Adam have been talking about. There's lots of fascinating detail in the publications that have already come out and that will be coming out over the next few months. So look out for them on the SLRC website. If you've been fascinated and inspired by what Rangina is talking about, talk to her more about Kandahar Treasure, and she'll be around after lunch to give you the details of where to do that, and might want to give a quick plug in her final thoughts. So, I mean, it's certainly easy to be pessimistic about Afghanistan. I think that the discussion we've had has actually been refreshingly optimistic in some ways. Clearly, it's very difficult to break out of the depressing equilibrium that I sort of had as a phrase to start with. But that doesn't mean that there aren't possibilities, that there aren't ways of getting beyond the thugs and criminals, of getting beyond narrow value chain approaches, of looking at how things actually work rather than how we'd like them to work, of looking at emerging private systems as well as public systems in terms of access to services. A question I had that I didn't fit in is in the introduction to the meeting, we trotted out the line that the Afghan government increasingly doesn't control half the country. So there was a question mark in my head over what's happening in that half of the country that we don't access and aren't doing research on. But we might have to save that till lunchtime. So on a slightly optimistic note, I will hand back to the panel for any final thoughts, and then we can have lunch.
I want to share with you a small story. Pindo is probably my age, late 30s, and she's unmarried in Kandahar, which is very unlikely, but there's a great population of young women who never married during the years of war. And she was suffering from severe headaches when I first saw her, met her in her home, poor home, where she was embroidering very beautiful, fine stitches. After several visits to her, as I got to know her, we needed a person to come and work in the office, so someone that would be there full-time for us to create designs and create prototypes. And when I asked her, she immediately turned to her old father at that time, saying, will I have permission from him? And since he was sitting, he luckily liked me. He said, of course she can work with you. So Pindo started working in the office daily, and her house was not too far, so she would walk each day to and from work. When Pindo first joined us in our weekly staff meeting, the staff meetings included our men, the drivers and the security guards as well. Pindo was sitting in the corner, completely covered, shy, timid, she would not even shut a word. 15 years later, or 14 years, actually no, less than 13 years later, Pindo is the supervisor of our facility. She commands not only the women of how to do their work, but she proudly stands showing her face, telling the guards and the procurement officer and the driver where to go, how to go, and if they make mistakes, she tells them that they've made a mistake. So the transformation is possible and has been possible in Afghanistan. The Afghan people will change, and they're strong enough, willing enough to be able to bring the desired change to their lives. Coming to the phone story, Pindo did not own a phone when we first hired her. It was unthinkable for any of our female folks to own a phone. Today, all of our 27 female staff have not just one, but sometimes 2 or 3, and some of the younger ones are actually investing, saving their salaries to invest in an iPhone. So things are changing, and they will change. And my last request to all of you who are still interested in Afghanistan, and I thank you, and I want you to pass this message along that we Afghans believe in quality over quantity. Quantity makes it difficult because we're not receiving or achieving the kind of results that we want to see in a quick 10-year or 15-year period. But if you work with Afghans in a qualitative manner, with quality projects, I promise you that you're bound to see positive results. And there are plenty of examples on the ground, so let's not hope on that.
I don't think I can add anything more.
Wonderful way to end. Let's have lunch. Thank you very much all for coming.